It is the morning of the 17th of November, 1953. The wind is coming hard off the Atlantic, the way it always does here. The channel between the island and the mainland is grey and moving. 22 people are leaving their home for the last time. They carry what they can: a dresser, a few sticks of furniture, a holy picture off a wall. Down at the little slip, a boat is waiting to take them across. Some of them are weeping. The oldest among them have never lived anywhere else. Neither did their parents. Neither did their parents' parents, back and back, further than anyone can count. By nightfall, the island behind them is empty. It has been lived on for centuries. It will never be lived on again. The island is called the Great Blasket. It sits 3 miles off the coast of Kerry, at the far southwestern corner of Ireland, which is the far southwestern corner of Europe. And the story of why those 22 people had to leave is, in miniature, the story of this entire coast. Because the thing most of us think we know about Ireland, the soft, easy, 40 shades of green idea of it, is not quite the whole truth. Not out here, not on the edge. This is Ireland. Not all of it, not Dublin, not the motorways, not the glass offices along the eastern shore. This is the other Ireland, the western one, the one that turns its face to 3,000 miles of open ocean, with nothing at all in between. From the air, it does look like the postcard, a patchwork of small green fields stitched together with grey stone walls, running right up to the lip of cliffs that drop straight into white water. But look closer. On much of this coast, that green is not a gift. It is a construction. In some places, the soil the grass grows in did not exist until people made it. Carried up from the shore, basket by basket, seaweed and sand laid down on bare rock by hand. The green edge of Europe is, in more places than you would think, a thing that was built. And the question this coast has been asking for 5,000 years is a simple one. Why would anyone choose to live here? And how, once they chose it, did they manage to stay? Start with the green itself, because the strangest thing about this coast is that it is green at all. Ireland sits far to the north. On a globe, it lines up with the frozen coast of Labrador and with the middle of Hudson Bay, places locked in ice for half the year. By rights, this should be a cold, hard, subarctic island. It is not. It is soft and wet and mild. Frost is rare on the western shore, and the reason is the ocean. A vast current of warm water, born in the Gulf of Mexico, crosses the entire Atlantic and washes up against this coast first, before anywhere else in Europe. It carries the heat of the tropics north and breathes it out over these islands. It is why palm-like plants grow in sheltered Kerry gardens. It is why the grass stays green straight through the winter. So the same ocean that isolates this coast and floods it and drowns its fishermen is also the one thing that makes it livable at all. The Atlantic is the threat, and the Atlantic is the gift. It has always been both. Begin in the north. In County Donegal, where the road they now call the Wild Atlantic Way begins its long run south. It starts at Malin Head, the northernmost point of the island, a low green fist of land shoved out into the sea. On a bad day, the spray comes over the top of it. A little way down the coast, the land rears up. Slieve League, sea cliffs of almost 600 meters, nearly 2,000 feet, among the highest in Europe. Close to 3 times the height of the more famous cliffs further south. Stand at the top, with the wind trying to peel you off the grass, and the question arrives on its own. Who looks at a wall of rock like this, at the very end of the land, with the ocean roaring underneath, and decides to build a life on top of it? And yet the townlands here are full, not crowded, but full. There are houses tucked into every fold of the hills, and in many of them, the first language spoken at the kitchen table is not English, it is Irish. This is a Gaeltacht, one of the places where the old language of the island is still simply the language of home. We will come back to that, to why the language lives here, of all places, at the edge and almost nowhere in the comfortable middle. But hold the question for now. The cliffs are not empty. Along the top edge, where the short grass meets the drop, a black bird tumbles on the updrafts. Red bill, red legs. It falls and catches itself and falls again, for no reason anyone can see except that it can.
This is the chough,
a member of the crow family and one of the rarest. It feeds by digging insects and grubs out of thin, cropped turf, which means it can only live where the grass is kept short, where sheep and cattle still graze the coastal fields the way they have for centuries. Across much of Britain, the chough vanished as that kind of farming died. Here, on the Atlantic fringe, the old grazing never fully stopped, so the bird hung on. Its whole world is a narrow seam. The line where the land people worked meets the edge the sea left wild. It is a creature of the border. It lives exactly where we are standing. Move south into County Mayo. The land here flattens into bog, brown, wet, treeless, stretching to the base of blue mountains. It looks like the emptiest place imaginable, land that no one has ever touched. But under the bog, they found walls. At a place called Cade Fields, archaeologists dug down through the peat and uncovered a whole system of stone field boundaries. Dividing lines, enclosures, a farmed landscape laid out and walled and then slowly buried as the bog grew over the top of it. The walls are almost 6,000 years old, the oldest known field system anywhere on Earth. People were dividing this edge into fields and building walls to mark them before the pyramids at Giza were raised. Remember those walls? We are going to keep meeting them all the way down this coast. Off the Mayo coast lies Achill Island, the largest island off Ireland, joined to the mainland now by a short bridge. On the slope of a mountain called Slieve Moor, there is a village, or there was. Perhaps 100 small stone houses in a long line along the hillside, all of them roofless now. Grass growing where the floors were. It is called simply the deserted village. For a long time, people lived here in a rhythm older than memory. In summer, families would drive their cattle up to the high pasture and live beside them in these houses. In winter, they came back down to the shore, following the grass up and down the mountain year after year. And then, in the middle of the 19th century, something happened to this coast that it has never fully recovered from. In 1845, a disease arrived in the potato fields. To understand what came next, you have to understand the potato. On the poor, rocky, rain-soaked ground of the West, almost nothing else would grow well. But the potato would. A family could feed itself for a year off a patch of ground the size of a garden. By the 1840s, roughly a third of the entire country depended on it. In the West, the poorest, the most dependent, that share was higher still. Then the blight came, a mold blown in on the wind that turned the potatoes to black slime in the ground. It came in 1845, and it came again and again across most of a decade. We call it a famine, as if the food had simply run out. But through the worst of those years, grain and cattle and butter kept leaving Irish ports, sailing for England under guard, while people a few miles inland starved. The numbers are almost too large to feel. In 1844, this island held about 8.5 million people. By 1851, it held 6.5 million, roughly 1 million dead, of hunger and of the fevers that follow hunger. 1 to 2 million more gone onto ships. Many of those ships were so crowded and so filthy that they earned a name of their own, the coffin ships. On some crossings, a fifth of the people aboard did not arrive. And the law made it worse. Relief, when it came at all, came through the workhouse, a place so grim that families dreaded it more than hunger itself. And a rule was brought in that no one holding more than a quarter acre of land could receive any help. To eat, a starving family first had to surrender the very ground that might one day feed them. Hundreds of thousands did. Their cabins were pulled down behind them so they could not creep back. The worst single year of it they still call Black 47. Even the help was cruel. Rather than simply hand out food, the authorities set the starving to work, building roads that led nowhere and walls around nothing, so that relief could be called wages instead of charity. You can still find them on the western hills, famine roads ending in the middle of a field, walls raised by dying hands enclosing empty ground, monuments to a hunger that was managed on paper as a problem of accounts. The West was hollowed out, and you can still read it in the land. On the empty hillsides above the deserted village, and on 1,000 slopes like it, the ground is faintly corrugated, long, low, parallel ridges under the grass. Lazy beds. The ridges where the potatoes were planted by people who are not here anymore. The country would not reach its pre-famine population again for a very long time. In parts of the West, it never has. Not far from here rises a cone-shaped mountain called Croagh Patrick. For well over 1,000 years, pilgrims have climbed it. On one Sunday each July, thousands still do. Some of them barefoot, on the sharp scree, all the way to the little chapel at the summit. And out in the wide, island-scattered water of Clew Bay, there is the memory of a different kind of figure. In the 16th century, these were the waters of Grace O'Malley, Granium Whale, a sea captain and clan leader who commanded a fleet, taxed those who fished her coast, and once sailed to London to bargain face-to-face with Queen Elizabeth I, the pirate queen of the West. The kind of person this coast has always produced, hard, salt-cured, and not easily moved. South again, into Connemara. This is the West at its most elemental, bog and rock and water and light, under a range of quartzite peaks called the 12 Bends that change color with every passing cloud. A road called the Sky Road climbs above Clifton and shows you the whole broken coastline at once. Headlands, inlets, islands, the Atlantic beyond. And everywhere, the walls. Grey stone walls running up the hillsides, many of them enclosing nothing now, climbing to places no farmer would bother to farm today. They are the fingerprints of a time when far more people lived here, and every square meter of cleared ground was worth the labor of walling it. Connemara is a Gaeltacht too, a stronghold of the Irish language. And here we can finally answer the question we left up in Donegal. We tend to picture the Irish-speaking West as something quaint, preserved, a heritage kept alive out of love. The truth is harder than that. Irish survived out here not because it was treasured, but because this was where the poverty was. Over centuries, English spread through the towns, the trade, the schools, the places with money and power. The language of the old country was pushed westward, into the hills, the bogs, the islands, into exactly the ground that was too poor, too remote, too hard to bother anglicizing. The language retreated to the edge because the edge was the one place left with nowhere to push it. The bog itself tells a version of the same story, of things that survive by being left alone. Peat forms where the ground is so wet and so starved of oxygen that dead plants cannot rot. Instead of decaying, they pile up, layer on layer, pressed down century after century until they become a brown, spongy, ancient fuel. Cut it in blocks, stack it, let the wind dry it, and it burns. For most families on this coast, for most of history, that was the heat in the house. That smell, turf smoke, low and earthy and sweet, is the smell of the western winter. Fuel dug straight out of the ground beneath their feet because there was no forest left to cut and no coal to buy. And there was no forest, though there had been one once. After the last ice age, Ireland was thick with oak and elm and pine. Over thousands of years it was cleared, for farmland, for firewood, for timber to build ships and smelt iron, until one of the least wooded countries in all of Europe was what remained. The bare, wind-scoured openness we now take for the natural face of the West is, like so much else here, a thing that people made. The bogs spread across the ground where the trees had stood. But a language is not a bog. It cannot survive simply by being left alone. Today, across the whole country, only around 72,000 people speak Irish every day. Barely 1.5 in every 100. Inside the Gaeltacht itself, the heartland, the number of daily speakers falls with almost every census. Young people leave for work or find they cannot afford a house in their own townland once the holiday homes have bid the prices up. And when the young go, the language goes quiet in another kitchen. The map of where Irish is truly spoken has been shrinking for 200 years. It is now down to a scattering of coastal fragments, Donegal, Connemara, and one peninsula far to the south that we are traveling towards. Hold that thought too. We are not finished with it. At dusk in early summer, in the damp meadows of Connemara and the islands, you might hear something before you see the bird that makes it. A dry, rasping, mechanical call over and over out of the long grass. Crex. Crex. It is the corncrake, a small, secretive relative of the moorhen, so shy it is almost never seen, only heard. Once, that call was the sound of the entire Irish countryside in June. It was everywhere. Then the way people cut grass changed. Machines replaced the scythe. Meadows were mown earlier and faster, and the corncrake's nests, hidden in the tall grass, were destroyed before the chicks could run. Across most of Ireland, the call fell silent. Now, only a few hundred calling males are left. And where do they hold on? on the same western islands and the same Mayo and Donegal fringes where people too still hold on. Where the old, slow way of cutting the grass late in the year has survived, because the people who do it have survived. The corncrake's map and the human map are almost exactly the same map. When the last of the old farming goes, they will both go together. Cross the invisible line into County Clare, and the ground changes under your feet completely. It turns to stone, pale grey limestone, cracked into vast, flat slabs, stretching from the hills right down to the sea. Bare, silver, and at first glance, dead. This is the Burren. When Cromwell's army came through in the 17th century, one of his officers looked at it and wrote that it was a country with not enough water to drown a man, not enough wood to hang him, and not enough earth to bury him. He could not have been more wrong about what it was, because that same barren rock holds around 70% of all of Ireland's native wildflowers. On one hillside, in one afternoon, you can find plants that have no business growing anywhere near each other. Here is a mountain avon, an Arctic flower, a plant of the high, frozen north left behind by the glaciers, and growing right beside it, a dense-flowered orchid, a Mediterranean plant, a thing of warm southern hillsides. Species that in the wild are separated by thousands of miles, sharing the same crack in the same stone. It works because of the rock itself. The pale limestone soaks up the summer sun and stores it, then releases that warmth slowly through the winter, so the frost rarely bites deep. That keeps the southern plants alive. And that same pale stone throws light back up into the air so brightly that the Arctic plants, which are used to endless polar summer daylight, feel almost at home. And then there are the people. For generations, farmers here have done something found almost nowhere else. They graze their cattle up on the bare hills in winter, the opposite of everywhere else on Earth, which keeps the grass cropped and open and stops any one aggressive plant from choking out the rest. They call it winterage, a garden, in other words, made by three things working together: ancient rock, reflected light, and a farming calendar turned upside down. The Burren hides another southern secret low to the ground. On damp mornings, on the mossy boulders of Kerry and West Cork, you can find a slug, but not a plain grey one. This one is dark and spotted all over like a tiny leopard. When you touch it, instead of shrinking, it rolls itself up into a ball. It is the Kerry slug, and in the entire world, it lives in only two places: the mountains of southwest Ireland and the mountains of northern Spain and Portugal. Nowhere in between, not in England, not in France. It is a creature of the warm south, stranded here on this cold northern rock since the end of the last ice age. A living echo of those Mediterranean flowers on the hill above. Life that by every rule should not be here at all, and is, clinging on at the edge. Where the Burren's stone runs into the sea, County Clare gives us the most famous edge of all: the cliffs of Moher, a wall of dark rock over 200 meters high at its tallest, running for miles with the whole weight of the Atlantic throwing itself against the base of it. At the top stands a small round stone tower built almost 200 years ago so that visitors could stand and look at the sheer drop. From a distance, the cliff face looks like the deadest place on the coast, a blank vertical wall. It is nothing of the kind. It is a city. Look closer, and the ledges are packed with life. Guillemots, standing shoulder to shoulder in their thousands, like tenants on a crowded balcony. Razorbills, kittiwakes, calling their own name into the wind. And up at the top, in burrows in the soft soil at the cliff's edge, one bird that most people come here hoping to see. The Atlantic puffin. Small, upright, with a beak painted like a clown's, orange and blue and yellow, and a look of permanent, comic seriousness.
A puffin comes to this cliff.
Only to breed, April to August. It digs a burrow or reuses an old one, and both parents take turns keeping the single chick fed, flying out over the water and coming back with rows of little silver sand eels held crosswise in the beak. And then, at the end of the summer, it leaves, and this is the part that stops you. For the rest of the year, 8 months of it, the puffin does not come to land at all. It lives alone, far out on the open North Atlantic. It sleeps on the surface of the sea. It rides out the winter storms on the water. A bird, small enough to hold in 2 hands, alone on the whole grey ocean. And the following spring, it comes back. Not just to Ireland, to this cliff, very often to the very same burrow. A creature that spends most of its life on the open sea and still, every year, finds its way home to a few feet of Irish rock. It is hard not to think of all the people this coast sent out across that same ocean, and of how many of them, or their children, or their children's children, came looking for the way back. Out in the mouth of Galway Bay lie 3 islands, the Aran Islands, Inishmore, Inishmeen, and Inisheer. Geologically, they are a piece of the Burren, broken off and set out in the sea, the same pale limestone, which means the same problem, only worse. Cut off by miles of water and with almost no natural soil at all. So the people who settled here did the most extraordinary thing on this entire coast. They made the land. Not metaphorically, literally. Faced with bare rock, they built soil where none existed. Here is how. First, they broke up the surface stone and cleared it into piles. Then, they went down to the shore and gathered seaweed, load after load, and carried it up. They mixed it with sand hauled from the beaches and with animal dung, and they laid this mixture, by hand, into the cracks and hollows of the limestone. Seaweed, it turns out, is one of the finest fertilizers there is. It is rich in nitrogen, in potash, in the trace minerals a plant needs. The sea was delivering it, free, to the door. All it cost was the labor of carrying it up the cliff on your back and the patience to wait years while it rotted down into something that could grow grass. That is the green of the Aran Islands. It was carried up from the sea, one basketful at a time, over centuries. And the stone they cleared to make room, that went into walls. On Inishmore, the largest island, there are said to be over 1,000 miles of dry stone walls. No mortar holds them. They are simply balanced, stone on stone, so that the wind blows through the gaps instead of pushing them over. From the air, the island looks like a cracked grey mosaic. Thousands of tiny fields, some barely bigger than a room. The walls were not only boundaries, they were shelter. They broke the force of the Atlantic gales and stopped that precious, handmade soil from simply blowing back into the sea it came from. The islanders were not the first to grasp what this place demanded. Perched on the lip of a 100-meter cliff on Inishmore is a stone fort called Dún Angasa, 3,000 years old. Its great curved walls end, deliberately, exactly at the edge of the drop, so that the cliff itself becomes the final defense. Nobody knows for certain what it was. A fortress, a gathering place, a temple to the setting sun. But whoever built it here. at the outermost edge, facing the emptiest ocean. And the islanders kept themselves alive and warm in the same resourceful way they made their fields. The Aran sweater, known now all over the world, began as working clothing, knitted from undyed baleen wool with the natural lanolin left in the fiber so that it shed the rain, and worked in tight, complex stitches, perhaps 100,000 of them in a single jumper that trapped the warmth, a garment built for a life spent leaning into the wind. The houses were built to the very same logic, long and low, so the gales passed over them instead of into them. Walls of stone or packed earth, a full arm's length thick, holding the day's heat the way the Burren Rock does. Small windows, and fewer of them, on the side that faced the weather. A roof of thatch, reed or straw, pinned down beneath a net of ropes weighted with heavy stones, so that no gust could peel it away. Whitewashed against the damp, with a single turf fire at the heart of it that was never quite allowed to die. Every line of that house was an argument with the wind, and the house, more often than not, won. And the language. On Aran, Irish is not a subject you study. It is the language of the shop, the pier, the pub, the kitchen table. Children grow up switching between Irish and English, depending on who comes through the door. It survived here for the oldest reason of all. There was, quite simply, nowhere further west for it to go. Everything about these islands, the fields, the walls, the warmth, the words, was made by hand and held by hand against an ocean that would happily take all of it back. And the seaweed that built the fields has found a second life. Along this coast today, families still go down at low tide to cut it, exactly as their grandparents did. But now, some of it travels on, into food, into cosmetics, into health supplements sold clear across Europe. The same brown weed that was once hauled up the cliffs to make soil out of nothing is, 2 centuries on, quietly making a living for the people who stayed. The sea is still leaving this coast its raw materials, free, at the door. The trick, as it always was, is knowing what to do with them. Now go back to the Kerry coast and look out to sea. About 12 kilometers offshore, a jagged pyramid of rock climbs straight out of the water to a double peak. It has no beach, almost no flat ground, no trees, no fresh water except the rain that falls on it. It is called Skellig Michael, and people once chose to live there, on purpose. It is sometime in the 6th century. A small group of monks climbs into a boat of tarred hide stretched over a wooden frame and rows out from the mainland, hour after hour, toward that rock on the horizon. They are not being sent. They are not being punished. They are looking, deliberately, for the hardest, loneliest, most difficult place they can possibly find. Because to them, the difficulty is the entire point. It is called peregrinatio, a voluntary exile, a stripping away of every comfort in order to be closer to God. They find the rock, and they climb it. What they built there is still standing. They cut over 600 steps into the near vertical stone by hand over generations. Near the summit, 600 feet above the sea, they built a cluster of small stone huts shaped like beehives. And here is the craft that keeps them dry to this day. There is no mortar in them, not a drop. The monks laid each ring of flat stones so that it oversailed the ring below by a finger's width, then the next ring further in, and the next, spiraling inward and upward until the walls met and closed themselves at the top. Corbelling, done so precisely that after 1,400 years of Atlantic storms, the insides of those huts are still dry. They lived on rainwater, on the eggs and flesh of seabirds, on fish, and on a tiny garden of soil they carried up and terraced behind more of those dry stone walls. They held the rock for around 600 years, the most westerly monastery in Europe. For the men who built it, this truly was the edge of the known world. Beyond it, only open water and whatever they believed lay past the horizon. And they looked at that edge and walked toward it, because it was the edge. There is one more thing about this far southwestern corner worth knowing, because it turns the whole idea of the edge inside out. Just off the Kerry coast lies Valentia Island, and in 1866, after years of failure and snapped cables lost on the sea floor, the first lasting telegraph line across the Atlantic was hauled ashore right here. A message that once took 2 weeks by ship could suddenly cross the ocean in minutes. For a moment, the far, poor, emptying edge of the old world was also the single closest point to the new one. The place everyone was sailing away from was at the same time the place from which the two continents first reached out and touched. Inland from here, cupped among Kerry's mountains, lies one last remnant of the island that existed before the axes came. Killarney's oak woods, one of the few native forests the island did not lose. Moss hangs in curtains from the branches. The ground lies deep in fallen leaves, and moving quietly through it is a herd of red deer, the largest wild animal in the country, descended from stock that has run these hills since the end of the Ice Age. Never introduced, never replaced, a living thread back to the forested island that once was, kept unbroken in a single green valley. Come back to the mainland now, onto the Donegal Peninsula, and follow the road out to Slee Head, the very tip of it, the westernmost point of mainland Ireland. And there, across a few miles of restless water, are the Blasket Islands, where we began. It would be easy standing here to see all of this as a museum, a beautiful, finished, dead thing, a coast that used to be alive. That would be a mistake.
Donegal is a working town.
The boats still go out before dawn, and on a wet Tuesday night in the off-season, when there is not a tourist in sight, someone in the corner of a pub will take out a fiddle, and someone else a bodhrán, and the music that fills the room is not a performance. It is just what people here do when the weather is bad and the company is good. Out on the water, currachs are still built and still raced. A currach is a boat you could carry on your shoulders, tarred canvas stretched over a light wooden frame, almost nothing between you and the ocean. It is very close to the boat the Blasket men rowed. For the people of this coast, that fragile boat was the whole argument of their lives. The sea was the larder, the mackerel and the herring and the lobster that carried a family through the year, and the sea was the grave. Almost every village along this shore has its own story of a night when the boats went out, and not all of them came home. To live here was to push a skin of tarred cloth out onto the open Atlantic, again and again, knowing precisely what it could do to you, because the alternative was to go hungry. They did it anyway, for centuries. And along Slee Head, the language in the shops and the houses is Irish. This is not a place remembering how to live on the edge. It is still doing it. Follow the road all the way to its end, and it runs down into County Cork, out along the long, stony finger of the Beara Peninsula. At the very tip, a small cable car, the only one in Ireland, and one of the very few in Europe that crosses open sea, swings out over a wild sound to Dursey Island, carrying the post, the groceries, and when it must, a farmer's sheep. A handful of people still live out there, on the far side of that swaying wire, for no better reason than that it is home. And then, at last, the coast relents. The road ends at Kinsale, a snug harbour town of painted houses and good food, where the Atlantic finally loses its temper and the long, wild road comes quietly to a close. 2,500 kilometres of edge from Malin Head to here. Before we cross to the islands, one more turn of the coast, because it complicates the sad story we have been telling. Up in Galway, on its own bay, there is a city, and the Galway of today does something the rest of this coast has struggled to do for 200 years. It grows. While the village is emptied, this one western city filled. A young university town full of students and musicians and festivals where you will hear Irish spoken on the street, not as a heritage exercise, but simply as the language two friends happen to be using. The old Claddagh fishing village at its heart gave the world a ring, and the whole place hums with a specific energy, the energy of a coast that in this one spot learned not just how to survive, but how to hold on to its young. The edge did not only lose people. In one place at least, it found a way to keep them. But now, we have to go back across the water, back to the 17th of November, back to the Great Blasket. Across the 20th century, this coast emptied island by island. Inishark, Inishmurray. One community after another, worn down by the same slow forces. No doctor closer than a rough sea crossing, no work for the young, the mainland pulling with its lights and its wages. The Great Blasket was one of the last and the most famous to fall silent. At its height, perhaps 150 people lived on it. There was no priest living among them, no shop, no pub, no doctor. And yet for its size, this bare rock produced one of the most remarkable outpourings of writing anywhere in Europe. It happened because in the early 20th century, scholars began to arrive. They came for the island's Irish, which was pure and old and unbroken by the modern world. And the islanders, encouraged, began to do something no one had asked them to do before. They began to write down their own lives. Tomás Ó Criobhan was a fisherman. He wrote a book called An Tuilleanach, the Islandman, a plain, unsentimental account of a life spent wringing survival out of the sea. And he ended it with a line that has haunted the island ever since. He wrote that they had been people the like of whom would never exist again. Manabe ar lehedi arish an. A young man named Murish O'Sullivan wrote 20 Years A-Growing, about a boyhood on the island, full of light and mischief and the sea. And an old woman named Paig Sayers, who could not write, told the story of her hard life aloud, and it was taken down word for word. Her book became, for generations of Irish schoolchildren, the most dreaded text on the whole curriculum, a byword for gloom. And then, much later, the thing many of them were quietly grateful had been written down at all. A tiny island at the end of Europe with no shop and no doctor and no pub, and it left behind a library. Those 3 books have since been translated into a dozen languages and are read in universities on the far side of the world, carrying the voice of a place that a person can no longer live in out to people who will never set foot on it. But you cannot eat a library. The island had no harbour deep enough for a modern boat. Everything still had to go by currach through dangerous water. The young were leaving, mostly for one American city, Springfield, Massachusetts, where so many Blasket people settled that a piece of the island took root on the far side of the ocean. And with every young person who left, there was one fewer pair of strong arms to launch a boat into a heavy sea. One fewer to fetch a doctor when the weather turned. By the early 1950s, there were barely 20 people left, and most of them were old. It is the morning of the 17th of November, 1953. The government boats come across the Sound. The last families carry their belongings down to the slip: a dresser, a table, a picture off the wall. The cattle are driven into the water to swim behind the curraghs to the mainland. Among the 22 is a boy. For years, he has been the only child on the island, with no other children to play with. The newspapers called him the loneliest boy in the world. They pull the doors shut behind them. There is no need to lock them. No one is coming. The government resettled the islanders on the mainland at Dunquin in new houses set within sight of the island. For the rest of their lives, many of them could stand at their own doors and look out across the Sound at the roofless village where they had been born. Close enough to see, too far and too final ever to go back. The island went quiet. Within a few winters, the roofs fell in, and the walls of the houses stood open to the weather, the way they still stand today. The people of the Great Blasket had lived on that rock for centuries and made poetry out of it, and in a single grey morning, it was over. The like of them, as the islandman had written, would never be again. And yet the island did not stay empty for long. It simply stopped belonging to us. On the beaches where the curraghs once landed, the largest population now is not human. It is grey seals. In the autumn, they haul out by the hundred on the white sand, and the pups are born there, white-coated, in the ruins of the old landing place. The grey seal is the biggest wild animal in these islands. It carries its own kind of persistence, long-lived, deep-diving, faithful to the same breeding beaches across whole lifetimes. The people left the Blasket, and the sea, patiently, took its island back. So, how do people live on Europe's green edge? The honest first answer, the one the postcard never tells you, is that very often they don't. They left. 1 million to the graves of the famine, millions more onto the ships. The islands emptied, one after another, until the last old people were carried off in government boats. The corncrake's call has thinned to a few hundred voices, and the language that was once the whole country's is now, as a living daily tongue, the language of about 1.5 people in 100. We come here, most of us, looking for the postcard. 40 shades of green, a fiddle in a warm pub, a ruined castle in the rain, and every bit of it is real. But the postcard leaves out the cost. It leaves out the seaweed carried up the cliff on a man's back. It leaves out the doors pulled shut for the last time. And yet, the walls are still there. On Aran, when a winter storm knocks a gap in one of those 1,000 miles of dry stone wall, someone, eventually, goes out and rebuilds it. Stone balanced on stone, no mortar, exactly the way it was built the first time. The making of the land, begun 6,000 years ago at Cada, has never entirely stopped. And people are moving back. For the first time in generations, the population of some of these western districts is rising rather than falling. A road that once ran only outward now runs both ways. Some come for the quiet. Some come to raise their children where their own grandparents were raised. Some come because a laptop and a signal can now earn a city's wage from a house at the very edge of the sea. It is not enough, yet, to undo 200 years of leaving, but the direction has changed. The Great Blasket is not lived on. But every summer now, a small handful of people cross back over to care for it, to keep the paths and mind the ruins. And descendants come the whole way from Springfield to stand quiet in their grandparents' roofless kitchens. The children on Aran still switch from Irish to English and back again at the kitchen door, without thinking about it at all. And beyond the Gaeltacht, a new generation has begun choosing the old language on purpose. In music, on television, on the phones in their pockets, not to preserve something dead, but because it is theirs and they want it. And Valencia, the leaving place, the far edge that everyone sailed away from. That was also, in 1866, the exact spot where the cable came ashore that first joined the two halves of the world. The edge was never only an ending. It was always, at the same time, the place closest to somewhere else. Why would anyone choose to live here? Because someone always has. For 5,000 years, from the walls buried at Cada to the sweater being knitted by a fire in Donegal tonight, people have looked at a hard, wet, beautiful rock at the end of Europe and decided against every sensible argument to make it home. The green was never a gift. It was a choice, made and lost and made again. The edge is still there, and so, for now, are the people who keep choosing it. Thanks for watching. Until the next journey.